Criminal State, a closer look at Israel's role in terrorism by Jeff Gates. Part 1. When asked on September the 11th, 2001, what the attacks meant for US-Israeli relations, former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded, "It's very good. Well, it's not good, but it will generate immediate sympathy for Israel." Game theory war planners rely on mathematical models to anticipate and shape outcomes with staged provocations. For the agent provocateur, the reactions to a provocation, as well as the reactions to those reactions, thereby become predictable within an acceptable range of probabilities. With ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan poised to expand to Iran and Pakistan, it is time to take a closer look at how conflicts are catalyzed by way of deception. When Israeli game theorist Robert J. Aumann received the 2005 Nobel Prize in Economic Science, he conceded from Jerusalem, "The entire school of thought that we have developed here in Israel has turned Israel into the leading authority in this field." A professor at the Center for the Study of Rationality at Hebrew University, Aumann's Nobel lecture, titled War and Peace, expounded on the rationality of war. With a well-modeled provocation, a target's anticipated reaction can even become a weapon in the aggressor's arsenal. In response to the provocation of 9/11, how difficult was it to foresee that the US would deploy its military to avenge that attack? With US intelligence fixed by well-placed insiders around a predetermined goal, how difficult was it to anticipate that the reaction to 9/11 could be redirected to wage war in Iraq? The emotional component of a provocation plays a key role in game theory warfare. With a nationally televised mass murder of 3,000 people, a state of shock, grief, and outrage made it easier for Americans to believe that a known evildoer in Iraq was responsible, regardless of the facts. For false beliefs to displace real facts requires mental preconditioning so that a targeted population can be persuaded to put their faith in fictions. That conditioning enhances the probability of a successful deception. Those who deceived the US to invade Iraq in March 2003 began a decade beforehand to lay the mental threads and make the requisite mental associations to advance that agenda. Notable among those threads was the 1993 publication in Foreign Affairs of a theme-setting article by Harvard University professor Samuel Huntington. By the time his analysis appeared in book-length form in 1996 as The Clash of Civilizations, more than 100 think tanks were prepared to promote it. The result created a widely touted narrative, a thematic storyline supporting a clash consensus 5 years before 9/11 provided a plausible rationale for war. Also published in 1996 under the guidance of Richard Perle was A Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm, that is Israel. A member since 1987 of the US Defense Policy Board, this self-professed Zionist became its chairman in 2001. As an advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Perle's Pentagon advisory post provided a powerful insider position to shape the national security mindset around the removal of Saddam Hussein, a key theme of A Clean Break, released 5 years before 9/11. That same year, Netanyahu addressed a joint session of Congress at the invitation of Newt Gingrich, the Christian Zionist Speaker of the House. Murders, books, articles, think tanks, and well-placed insiders are common components in a probabilistic model deployed by war-planning game theorists. Lawmakers are also a customary ingredient. They provide credibility and a facade of legitimacy, a critical element when inducing a nation to war with phony intelligence fixed around a preset agenda. That role was eagerly filled by Senators John McCain, Joe Lieberman, a Jewish Zionist from Connecticut, and John Kyle, a Christian Zionist from Arizona, when they co-sponsored the Iraq Liberation Act of 1998.
The hard fact is that so long as Saddam remains in power, he threatens the well-being of his people, the peace of his region, the security of the world.
By promoting Israel's 1996 agenda for securing the realm, their legislation laid yet another mental thread in the public mindset by calling for the ouster of Saddam Hussein 3 years before 9/11. The legislation also appropriated $97 million to promote their agenda. Distracted by midterm congressional elections and impeachment proceedings, catalyzed by a well-timed presidential affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton signed that Zionist agenda into law in October 1998, 4.5 years before a US-led invasion removed the Iraqi leader. After 9/11, McCain and Lieberman became inseparable travel companions and irrepressible advocates for the invasion of Iraq. Striking a presidential pose aboard the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt in January 2002, McCain, a son and grandson of admirals, laid another mental thread when he waved an admiral's cap and proclaimed, "On to Baghdad," by way of deception. The confidence with which this game theory strategy progressed in plain sight could be seen in the behavior of Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz, another Zionist insider. 4 days after 9/11, while in a principals meeting at Camp David, he proposed that the US invade Iraq. At that time, the intelligence did not point to Iraqi involvement, and Osama bin Laden was thought to be hiding in a remote region of Afghanistan. On that same day, San Diego FBI Special Agent Stephen Butler interrogated Iraqi Munta Ghazal at his home near San Diego to determine if he was funding Mel Rockefeller, an American with whom Ghazal traveled to Baghdad in early 1997. After meeting for several days with a top nuclear physicist with oversight of Iraq's mothballed nuclear weapons program, Rockefeller returned to the US with a practical proposal for removing Saddam Hussein without this war and without triggering an insurgency. When regional specialists of the US Department of State would not meet with him, he traveled to Ottawa in April 1997, where he met with Middle East specialists in the Canadian government to ensure a written record was made to confirm there was an alternative to war in Iraq, 6 years before the invasion. Instead of debriefing him, FBI agents sought to discredit him. Though FBI agents interviewed Ghazal many times, they have yet to meet with Mel Rockefeller. Agent Butler cashed checks and paid rent for 2 San Diego-based men who allegedly piloted 2 of the planes on 9/11. The same Imam counseling Major Nidal Hassan, with FBI knowledge, before he was transferred to Fort Hood, also counseled the alleged San Diego-based hijackers, with FBI knowledge. As of December 1, 2009, no one from the FBI or National Security had debriefed Mel Rockefeller 8 years after 9/11. When President George H.W. Bush declined to invade Baghdad and remove Saddam Hussein during the 1991 Gulf War, Pentagon Under-Secretary for Policy Paul Wolfowitz imposed a no-fly zone in northern Iraq. By the invasion of March 2003, the Israeli Mossad had agents deployed for a decade in the northern Iraqi city of Mosul. Intelligence reports of Iraqi ties to al-Qaeda were also traced to Mosul, reports that proved false. Mosul again emerged in November 2004 as a center of the insurgency that destabilized Iraq. That reaction precluded the speedy exit of coalition forces promised in congressional testimony by senior war planner Wolfowitz in the lead-up to the invasion.
It's hard to conceive that it would take more forces to provide stability in post-Saddam Iraq than it would take to conduct the war itself and to secure the surrender of Saddam's security forces and his army. Hard to imagine, 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 hard to imagine.
Criminal State, a closer look at Israel's role in terrorism by Jeff Gates. Part 2. Was 9/11 an inside job? The common pro-Israeli source of the phony intelligence that induced war in Iraq has yet to be acknowledged, even though intelligence experts agree that deception on such a scale required a decade to plan, staff, pre-stage, orchestrate, and, until now, cover up. The leaders of the 9/11 Commission conceded they were thwarted by Commission members adamantly opposed to hearing testimony on the hijackers' motivation for 9/11, the US-Israeli relationship. The fictions reported as facts by mainstream media included Iraqi weapons of mass destruction.
Iraqi denials of supporting terrorism take their place alongside the other Iraqi denials of weapons of mass destruction. It is all a web of lies.
Iraqi ties to Al-Qaeda.
It says that a militant known as Abu Abdallah al-Iraqi had been sent to Iraq several times between 1997 and 2000 for help in acquiring poisons and gases. Abdullah al-Iraqi characterized the relationship he forged with Iraqi officials as successful.
Iraqi meetings with Al-Qaeda in Prague, Iraqi mobile biological weapons laboratories, and Iraqi purchases of yellowcake uranium from Niger. Only the last claim was conceded as bogus prior to the invasion. Only after the war began were the balance of the claims disclosed as false, flawed, or outright fabricated. An attempt to punish former U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, Joe Wilson, for his exposure of the phony yellowcake account led to a federal conviction of Vice Presidential Chief of Staff Louis Libby, another well-placed Zionist insider. The multi-decade consistency of agent provocateur fact patterns suggests that this game theory-modeled warfare includes the Israeli provocation that catalyzed the Second Intifada. An intifada is an uprising, or literally a shaking off, of an oppressor. The Second Intifada dates from September 2000, when Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon led an armed march to Jerusalem's Temple Mount, 1 year before 9/11. After a year of calm, during which Palestinians believed that Israel was sincere about peace, suicide bombings recommenced. As Sharon conceded, his march was meant to demonstrate Israeli control over a site considered holy by Muslims worldwide. In response to this second failed attempt at shaking off Israeli domination, Sharon and Netanyahu observed that only when Americans feel our pain would they understand the plight of the victimized Israelis. These Likud party leaders commented that the requisite empathy, feel our pain, would require a weighted body count of 4,500 to 5,000 Americans lost to terrorism. The initial estimates of those who died in the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center 1 year later. In other words, only with pain could we identify with the Israelis. Does that mean that only with a mass murder could we be induced to respond with our military to advance their agenda? Was the US response mathematically modeled at the Center for the Study of Rationality? 7 months after 9/11, Benjamin Netanyahu gave a speech in a US Senate office building, where he was introduced by Senators John Kyle and Joe Lieberman. American Valkyrie? When successful, game theory warfare strengthens the agent provocateur while leaving the target discredited and depleted by the anticipated reaction. By game theory standards, 9/11 was a strategic success because the US, by its response, was widely criticized for waging war on false pretenses. Only in hindsight did a deceived public realize that Iraq had nothing to do with that mass murder. However, that invasion had everything to do with securing the realm. Our response, predictably, triggered a deadly insurgency with devastating consequences for Iraqis, the US, and a coalition of the willing, led to war by a successfully duped US. From a game theory perspective, that insurgency was a predictable reaction in a nation populated by three long-feuding sects, Sunnis, Shiites and Kurds. A violent invasion led by a nation closely allied with Jewish nationalists only further fueled the flames of violence and extremism.
At least 55 people are dead.
Another foreseeable outcome. Until the US-led invasion, peace was maintained by an unsavory dictator and former US ally who was rebranded an evildoer in the lead-up to war. As the cost in blood and treasure from our liberation of Iraq expanded, the US became overextended militarily, financially, and diplomatically. The sectarian violence unleashed in Iraq is precisely what Messrs. Rockefeller and Ghazal were cautioned against in early 1997 should Saddam Hussein be removed suddenly and violently. The 1.3 million Iraqi deaths from war-related causes exceeds the worst of Saddam Hussein's atrocities. As any competent game theory war planner knew, the strategic winner in this war was certain to be Iran, as the US neutralized its key foe and is now urged by Israel to wage war on Iran. As the US, the primary target of this deception, emerged in the foreground, the agent provocateur faded into the background, but only after catalyzing dynamics that steadily drained the US of credibility, resources, and resolve. This probabilistic Israeli victory also ensured widespread cynicism, insecurity, distrust, and disillusionment, along with a steadily declining capacity to defend our real interests. Meanwhile, the American public came under a system of oversight and surveillance, packaged and sold as Homeland Security. This ominously titled operation includes rhetorical echoes of a World War II-era fatherland, featuring a domestic security force completely alien to US traditions. It is not yet clear whether this new agency was established to protect Americans, or whether it is meant to shield from Americans those responsible for deceiving us to wage their wars. In January 2003, Secret Service agent Richard Sears interrogated Mel Rockefeller at his home in Fresno, California, after he sent an email to Florida Governor Jeb Bush. The email said, in effect, that if the governor's brother, President George Bush, did not interview him on a public record prior to invading Iraq, he would do his best to ensure that lawful means were deployed to see the president executed for treason by a firing squad. When questioned by Sears, Rockefeller offered to have the agent speak with Dr. Glenn Olds, an advisor to 4 presidents, his senior advisor since 1994, and a former UN ambassador who assisted him in entering Iraq through Jordan at a time when Americans were prohibited from traveling there. Sears declined. Mel Rockefeller also repeated his intent to see the president executed for treason and insisted that he be charged and taken before a federal magistrate to present evidence that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction and that an alternative to war had been available since early 1997. Agent Sears declined his demand to be arraigned in a U.S. federal district court 7 weeks before the invasion. Agent Sears should be interviewed to see if, in retrospect, he agrees that, had this advice been followed, the war in Iraq may well have been prevented. To date, no one with line responsibility has interviewed Mel Rockefeller on a public record. Why? The answer to that question would reveal those responsible for this ongoing deception. The victims of these serial deceptions, including the families of those murdered in November at Fort Hood, may have a wrongful death cause of action against those with line responsibility who aided these operations by failing to engage the Rockefeller record in a timely fashion. Criminal State. A closer look at Israel's role in terrorism by Jeff Gates. Part 3. Foreseeable Futures. By manipulating the shared mindset, skilled game theory war planners can wage wars on multiple fronts with minimal resources. One proven strategy: pose as an ally of a well-armed nation predisposed to deploy its military in response to a mass murder. In this case, the result destabilized Iraq while creating predictable crises that could be exploited to greater strategic advantage by expanding the conflict to Iran, another Israeli goal announced in a clean break 7 years before the invasion of Iraq. Today's mathematically model-able outcomes undermined U.S. national security by discrediting our leadership, degrading our financial conditions, and disabling our political will. In game theory terms, this devastation was perfectly predictable, within an acceptable range of probabilities. Pakistan is primed to emerge as the next battleground for game theory war planners. When India, an ally of Israel, became the nation honored by the Obama administration's first state dinner, that occasion gave reason for concern due to the dynamics already at work in the background. In the asymmetry that typifies modern warfare, those who are few in number have no alternative when pursuing an expansionist agenda but to wage their wars by way of deception. To maintain its perceived status as a perennial victim, Israeli aggression must proceed non-transparently. Its only option is to operate with duplicitous means, including leveraging the power of its insider influence to advance an agenda from the shadows. Thus, the strategic necessity that this extremist enclave befriend the U.S. with the intent to betray that friendship to advance its geopolitical goals. Thus, the strategic need to create a relationship of trust with a post-World War II superpower in order to defraud us. How else could colonial Zionists wage their wars except with our military? How else could Jewish nationalists induce our aggression absent the widely shared belief that Israel is not an aggressor but a victim? Winning wars from the inside out. Game theory war planners manipulate the shared mental environment by shaping the perceptions and impressions that become consensus opinions. With a combination of well-timed crises, fixed intelligence, and a complicit media, policymakers can be induced to support a predetermined agenda, not because lawmakers are evildoers, but because the public mindset has been preconditioned to respond to manipulated thoughts, emotions, and beliefs. Without the mass murder of 9/11, would America's credibility be in tatters and its creditworthiness in jeopardy? By steadily displacing facts with false beliefs, those duplicitous few within the few amplify the impact of their deceit, and by their steady focus on the mental environment, their game theory war planners can defeat an opponent with vastly superior resources. Today's intelligence wars are waged in plain sight and under the cover of shared beliefs. By manipulating consensus opinion, PSYOPs wars can be won from the inside out by inducing a targeted populace to freely choose the very forces that imperil their freedom. Thus, in the information age, the power wielded by those with outsized influence in media, popular culture, think tanks, academia, and politics is disproportionate. In each of these critical domains, Zionist influence is pervasive, not only in the US, but also in other nations, induced to war on false pretenses. Germany offers a case study in manipulation of the public mindset in plain sight and under the banner of a free press. In 2003, Zionist media mogul Haim Saban acquired the second-largest media conglomerate in Germany. Why? Saban investment banker Steve Ratner explained his client's motivation: because Germany is important to Israel. Or, as Saban concedes, I have only one issue, and that issue is Israel. By 2005, Saban had succeeded in electing Angela Merkel as German Chancellor. She quickly became the European Union's most reliable and forceful advocate for Israel. By November 2009, she was prepared to sponsor in Berlin an unprecedented joint session of the German and Israeli governments. Following his political success in Germany, Saban acquired in 2007 a controlling interest in Univision, a Latino-focused network serving the fastest-growing voting bloc in the US. Media manipulation serves as an essential force multiplier to wage intelligence wars from the periphery, or, as with Chaim Saban, in plain sight. At the operational core of such psyops are game theory war planners skilled at personality profiling and masterful at anticipating responses to stage provocations and then incorporating those responses into their arsenals. In the case of Iraq, our mathematically foreseeable response to 9/11 led, in practical effect, to Israel's deployment of our military to invade Iraq. For aggressors adept at psyops warfare, facts are only an inconvenience to be overcome when waging war by way of deception. Thus, the key role played by consensus shapers featured in mainstream media outlets who focused not on informing the public, but on mental conditioning. For targeted populations dependent on facts and informed consent to protect their freedom and preserve the rule of law, such treachery poses the greatest possible threat. Yet, even now, many Americans believe that Israel is not an aggressor, but a victim, and even an ally, despite facts confirming a multi-decade pattern of expansionist nationalism and geopolitical deception. Adhering to an enemy. The US is far less secure than before 9/11. Tel Aviv clearly intends to continue its serial provocations as evidenced by its ongoing expansion of settlements and its continuing blockade of Gaza. Israel has shown no willingness to negotiate in good faith. With few exceptions, Barack Obama has named as senior advisors either Zionists or those known to be strongly pro-Israel. The greatest threat to world peace is not Islam. The most fundamental threat that underlies all others is our special relationship with a skilled agent provocateur. Without US support for an enclave of nuclear-armed religious extremists, the common source of this threat could long ago have been identified and steps taken to ensure its containment. In the same way that lengthy pre-staging was required to induce the US to invade Iraq, a similar strategy is now underway to persuade the US to invade Iran or support an attack by Israel.